Hello and welcome to Book Breaks. We are so thrilled to have you here today as we welcome Kate Masur and her book, Freedom Was in Sight, A Graphic History of Reconstruction in the Washington, D.C. region. And we'd like to thank viewers like you for your continued support of Book Breaks. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'm joined by my friend Ryan. Hey, Ryan. And without further ado, we're so thrilled today to have Kate Masur, professor of history and Board of Visitors professor at Northwestern University. She's the author of Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction. Welcome, Kate. We're so glad to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here with you guys.
Now, just to get us started, could you give us an overview of this work?
Sure. So the book that we're talking about today is, as you can see here, Freedom Was in Sight, A Graphic History of Reconstruction in the Washington, D.C. region. And this is, as it says, it's a graphic history. It's got 80 pages, or roughly 80 pages of graphic content with art by illustrator Liz Clarke, who's a really tremendous illustrator. And it tells the graphic history part of this book tells the history of the Reconstruction era in the Washington, D.C. region. It begins with the Civil War and it ends with the 1890s. So that might be something we talk about is the chronology that's covered in the book. Just so people who are here know, the book also, it begins with a short textual introduction. After the 80 or so pages of graphic history, it contains an essay that places the kind of regional events described in the book in the national history of Reconstruction. It also includes 8 primary sources that I selected that are associated with the stories that are told in the book. It has a timeline that puts the events in the book in the larger national timeline of Reconstruction. And it has an additional reading section as well. And that additional reading section tells people basically where I got the information that's in the book and where they can go for further reading that they might want to do.
Fantastic. And now, just because we're going to be talking about it as a graphic novel, we thought it'd be great. Ryan was going to show some images from the book, and you could just sort of, if you want to help set the scene with them.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to give people a little bit of the flavor of Liz's illustrations, and this is drawn from Public Books did a feature on the book, so you can find this on the web at the Public Books website. But what you're seeing here, this is just one frame in the book, right? So there's a lot in the book that depicts the everyday lives of African Americans during and after the Civil War. I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the book really centers African American people and Black history as it tells the history of Reconstruction. And one of the really beautiful things to me about the book is that with the graphic history format, we're able to really talk about everyday life. So, and we're able to talk about women, men, children as they experience the transition from slavery to freedom. So the picture you're seeing here is just one, again, this would be like one of 6 frames on a page. Of a family who are settled in a place called Freedman's Village, which is in what's now Arlington, Virginia, and just the sort of domesticity and stability of their lives, while the caption is saying they're actually about to be displaced from that place. And then if we just scroll down to our other example, again, one more frame from Liz's artwork. This is a scene of family reunification. One of the stories of Reconstruction is how after the end of slavery, Black family members really struggled to bring families back together that had been separated often by the domestic slave trade. And in this instance, this is the story of the Plummer family, who are a family from Prince George's County, Maryland. And one of their oldest daughters had been sold away from the DC region to New Orleans right as the Civil War began. And in the book tells the story, and again, one of the many strands of stories the book tells is about the Plummer family. It tells how they sent an older brother named Henry, who had been a sailor in the U.S. Navy during the war, to New Orleans after the war ended to try to find the sister, Sarah Miranda, and he succeeds in finding her, and they come home with her toddler son. And so this is a sort of joyful scene of the family coming back together. And this is one of, a kind of quintessential example of what some aspects of what this period was really about.
Yeah,
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for sharing these.
I loved their story. That was one of my favorite portions, the Plummer family. Now, can you tell us who Emma Brown was and why you had her serve as sort of the narrator for this work?
Sure. So the book Again, it covers a pretty long time period from the Civil War and the beginnings of the end of slavery during the war all the way to the 1890s, and it covers a lot of different places. So it weaves together stories. It's not the story of just one main character. And I began to think as Liz Clarke and I were finishing the first chapter, I started to get a little bit worried that there would be too much going on and there wouldn't be enough coherence in the book. And a lot of graphic histories in this sort of genre do have a narrator. Sometimes the narrator is the historian themselves, like telling the story of how they unearthed this story. I didn't really want to do that. And so we came up with the idea that this woman named Emma Brown would be the narrator. She was already a character in the book, but we established that she would also be the narrator throughout the book. And she was in real life the first teacher in the public schools newly established for African Americans during the Civil War in Washington. She was an African American woman who was born free in Washington, D.C. before the war, had the opportunity to attend a school called Myrtilla Minor School, which was established, again, before the Civil War by a white abolitionist woman named Myrtilla Minor. So Emma Brown went to Myrtilla Minor School for a while. She went to Oberlin College for a little while. And then she returned to DC and became the first Black teacher in the Black public schools, the first of any kind of teacher in the Black public schools in 1864. And she continued as a teacher. She later became a principal of the school. And so we tell her story in the book, but she also serves as a guide through the book. And she, for instance, there are title pages for each chapter, and she appears on the title page of each chapter, kind of introducing the chapter to readers, and then throughout the book as the narrator. Which was also really fun because one of the reasons she was, I thought, a good choice is there is one photograph of her that is held in the collections of the Library of Congress. So some of the people who appear in the book, we do have photos or sketches of them from the past. Other people we don't, but in her case, we did have a photo of her. And it's really great, I thought, to have a teacher as a narrator because she's in that role of educator. So she appears in front of a chalkboard at the beginning of each chapter, kind of telling people what the chapter is going to be about.
Yeah. And why have the book be set in Washington, D.C.?
Well, that actually goes to the origins of the book. So this book was actually commissioned by the Park Service, the National Park Service. And the person who had the idea for the book was a historian within the Park Service named Dean Herron. And he was at the time, he's now retired, but he was the chief historian of the DC region. And so he had applied for a grant within the Park Service. It was a grant that was designed to fund research and kind of interpretation of African American history in particular. And it was Dean's idea to do this book, and then the grant was what kind of paid for the book. And so the book it was always designed to be a graphic history of Reconstruction in the DC region. And for us, so the region is defined as Washington, DC proper, plus several counties in Northern Virginia, several counties in Maryland surrounding DC, and one county in West Virginia. And I really enjoyed that focus because it allowed us to think about a lot of different scenarios, including rural and urban, migration into the city from the countryside, people going back out into the countryside from the city, economic relationships that tied these areas together. So it was actually, it went really well beyond just focusing on the District of Columbia itself to think about this region more broadly.
Yeah, and Reconstruction is such a muddied period, and sort of especially when teachers are trying to teach it. What are some common misconceptions that you hope the book addresses?
That's a really good question. I mean, in some ways it's hard to say because I'm not sure. I mean, okay, there's first of all, it's very hard to teach Reconstruction, as you say. And I know that teachers often have very little time to teach it. And so one question is like, how do we teach it given that in a regular US history class, you're just so constrained by time? I think that there's a tendency sometimes to focus in on certain like the fight between President Andrew Johnson and Congress, the idea of like presidential Reconstruction followed by congressional Reconstruction, and kind of get into the nitty gritty and like on that. And that to me, as over time, as I've taught this period and at the college level, I have started to think that the central thing that people need to understand about Reconstruction is that this is the period in which the United States first grappled with the abolition of slavery. And really everything else flows from there. So yes, the fight between Johnson and Congress is important, but the sweep of things, the controversy about Reconstruction, the reasons that it is such a period of upheaval, we have to sort of keep our eye on the ball. And to me, that means emphasizing this is when the United States finally tried to end slavery and then faced all of these dilemmas about what the implications of that are. And so that's the through line, the narrative through line of the book, keeping African Americans, the people who experienced slavery and emancipation, at the center of the story, but really telling the story through that lens. And I feel like that helps us understand the true meaning and significance of Reconstruction more than other areas that one might focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we talked a little bit about the illustrations at the beginning of the program, but for me, one of the most powerful moments in the book is when you talk about lynchings and the way the illustrations sort of help sort of paint that picture. Can you tell us a little bit about how you approach that
Yeah,
topic?
I'll step back a second and kind of go back into the chronology question. So as I said before, the book begins with the Civil War because that is when, although obviously people had been fighting against slavery, enslaved people had been pushing back against enslavement, abolitionists had been fighting against slavery, but really a new stage in the process of abolishing slavery begins when the Civil War begins and federal troops enter the South. It creates new dynamics in which enslaved people are able to begin to escape and to sort of go toward Union lines. So that story is in the book. And then if we sort of take that unfolding story of emancipation, it makes very little sense to end the history of Reconstruction with 1877, the conventional end of Reconstruction. And so, which is something I'm happy to sort of go into later, but so we go all the way out to the end of the 1890s with this book. And what that means is that lynching has to be part of the book, right? Because lynching is a really important phenomenon of American history that kind of sees its peak in the beginning in the late 1880s and into the 1890s. And, you know, as we worked on the book and kind of thought through what was going to be in the book, to me, it felt like we can't dodge that, right? This is a book that is designed. We didn't really get to this question, but the book is designed for, we sort of had in mind ages 16 and up, including adults, right? And so, yes, it is geared toward younger people. Yes, it is. We hope that it can be taught in classrooms, but it cannot sidestep some of the hardest parts of this history. And so lynching had to be part of the book, but that raised all kinds of sticky questions about how to represent lynching. And, you know, I really see this in the context of both ongoing discussions of representations of lynching, which have been going on, visual representations of lynching, which I first tuned into in like around the year 2000. There was a really well-known photo exposition where somebody had collected a lot of actual photographs that had been taken of like lynched bodies, put them on display as a way of trying to push our country to grapple with the reality that this had really happened.
That was the witness exhibit?
Yeah, that it became that. And it generated a lot of controversy, a lot of questioning, like really searching questioning about how, on the one hand, you know, we don't want to avoid this history. On the other hand, it's very traumatic. It's very violent to see these images in a lot of ways. It's really tough to look at them. It can be re-traumatizing or can kind of have a sense of like kind of emphasizing victimization in a way that like is not necessarily what, if it's decontextualized in a certain way, it's not necessarily what one would want to do. And then the other thread of that conversation is recent conversations about the display and circulation of victims, Black victims of police brutality, and this idea, you know, the circulation of images of George Floyd and people talking about what does it mean, what is it doing to us to constantly have to be shown these or have them circulating. So both of those conversations fed into how I and Liz Clarke and then some experts that I consulted with on this chapter thought about it. And then I would say the third thing we thought about was actually visual artists working on this question, kind of like Carrie James Washington and a few other people who have really tried as artists to think about what we do with this history and with the sort of really violent visuals associated with lynching. So all of that is to say that in the end, what we did, which also again follows a number of Black artists and in their work, is to show the white. So it's about first of all, the man who's lynching I chose to depict is a man named James Carroll, who was lynched by a white mob in Frederick County, Maryland. And what we show visually is the kind of iconography of a noose and in the hands of a white person. And then we show the crowd looking up at James Carroll, but we don't show his body, but we show the white crowd watching what was happening and in some ways participating in it, since even if they didn't literally participate, they didn't do anything to stop it. I will say, since we're talking about this, I mean, that very like kind of the apex of the scene is surrounded by the story of James Carroll trying to escape from this lynch mob. It shows him being really afraid. And then we also have, and this was guided in part by some of the work that historian Kidada Williams has done, we also show, we don't know anything really about James Carroll's family, but in the case of other lynchings that we sort of allude to, we show grieving Black families and communities to emphasize that the people who were victims of lynching belong to other people in the sense of like, we're part of communities, we're part of families. And so we really try to put it in this larger context of African-American communities. I could say more about that because I haven't really talked about how we talk about white incitement of this violence, and also including like by the press. So another major sort of theme in this part of the book is how white newspapers kind of incited and amplified this kind of mob violence. And then also there's a fair amount in the book about how the Black press tried to fight back against that.
Yeah, and just to go back a little bit, because you were talking about chronologically why you decided not to end sort of at the typical ending point. Can you expound on that decision a little bit more and why you decided to go into the 1890s?
Sure. I mean, this has been a conversation among historians for a very long time in a lot of different ways. Sometimes people are surprised to know that the historian who is most known for sort of the thesis that there was a compromise of 1877. His name is C. Van Woodward. He's a very prominent Southern historian, sort of the mid-20th century, a professor at Yale, wrote about there having been a sort of bargain that was the compromise of 1877 that resolved supposedly the contested presidential election of 1876. And historians that came after Woodward, first of all, explored the idea of whether there had been such a bargain in a hotel room, like, you know, a kind of smoke-filled room. And if there had been a bargain, did the parties actually fulfill the bargain? And several historians who looked into this sort of said, you know, Woodward didn't have any evidence that there was an actual bargain that brought this matter to a close and allowed Rutherford Hayes to be president. And Woodward later came back later in his career and said, yeah, you know, I think I probably overstated that. And so first of all, just the notion of a formal compromise to bring that conflict over the presidential election to a close, there doesn't seem to be a lot of basis in fact that such a thing happened. So that's thing number one. But that's less of a substantive issue to me than why would even the contested presidential election of 1876 be the end of Reconstruction when the federal government's evidence of the federal government's decreasing desire to enforce Reconstruction was present long before that. So after the 1872 election, we begin to see quite a lot of refusal to enforce the Reconstruction amendments in the South, especially Black men's right to vote. And yet at the same time, the messiness of the period is shown in the fact that Black men continued to vote in many places long after 1877, in many places in the South. And at times of Republican Party ascendancy in Congress, there were continuing efforts to enforce Black men's right to vote in the South after 1877. So if you really look at what was going on before and after 1877, it doesn't look like a very clear break. Whereas the end of the 1890s really does. So by the end of the 1890s, so the way that I sort of see it is the Civil War and the abolition of slavery opened this period of contestation, this really open-ended period in which a huge number of things were newly possible. And it's a huge fight in a lot of ways. And how does that fight get resolved, and when does it get resolved? To me, we see a certain kind of resolution of it by the end of the 1890s, when you have first of all, the creation of new Southern state constitutions that formally disenfranchise Black men. You see the Supreme Court upholding those state constitutions rather than saying that they violated the 15th Amendment. You have Plessy versus Ferguson. You have the Wilmington Massacre in Wilmington, North Carolina, where there's essentially a coup. The federal government doesn't step in to stop it. And so by the end of the 1890s, you have a kind of new order emerging. Instead of the open-ended period of Reconstruction, you see the consolidation of the Jim Crow order, which is a new order. It's not the same as the order that defines slavery. It is a new thing that represents a kind of settlement of the fights that defined the Reconstruction period. So to me, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that it also kind of reflects the idea that the question of what to do when you abolish slavery in this country is at the center of the Reconstruction period.
Absolutely. Another one of my favorite moments towards the end of the book is the appearance of Frederick Douglass. Can you tell us a little bit about his appearance in the book?
Sure. Well, Frederick Douglass, is great to be able to include him because he lived in Washington, as many of you may know, in this period. His house was called Cedar Hill, and it's in what's now called Anacostia. It's a National Park Service site. And if you haven't been, I encourage people to visit it. And his sons were involved in developing that neighborhood, actually. So his sons make an appearance in the book as well. But he's kind of a local as part of local history, and he, was a very, very prominent man of his time by the post-Civil War period. He had very, high up connections in the Republican Party. He served as the DC Marshal, kind of was a little bit of a Republican playmaker. He could recommend people, especially African-American people, for appointments in the federal government and things like that. But what I found really interesting that I had not previously known was that, so the book partly tells, one of the stories we tell is the story of Jenny Dean, who was a Black woman who was from the area around Manassas, Virginia. And she had, during or soon after after the Civil War, had gone to Washington to go to school and work. And she was a devout Baptist as well. And she came back to Manassas and started Sunday schools. And then eventually, when she was grown and, she had this idea of founding a school, which became known as the Manassas Industrial School for Colored Youth. And Jenny Dean's story is told in some detail in the book. She did a lot of fundraising for the school, including going up north to fundraise. She went to a women's suffrage convention in Washington, D.C. and talked to white women about making contributions. She was very enterprising and also really deeply connected to her own home community. And so I learned that when her school opened, after all of this effort, when they finally opened the school on Labor Day weekend of 1894, Frederick Douglass was the keynote speaker at the opening of the school. And when I found that out, I was like, no way. Like, what? And then I was like, I wonder if we know what he said there, because many times, especially because he was so prominent by that stage in his life, like a newspaper would report on what he said. And sure enough, there was a full transcript. Probably he had submitted the written remarks to this newspaper. And so it was a wonderful, really interesting, really cool speech that he gave that day. And portions of that speech are one of the 8 primary sources in the back of the book. But, if I could just say a couple of things about what he talked about. I mean, one of the things I really like about the speech is he's directing the speech to young people because it's the opening of a school. And he is a pretty elderly person at that time. And he says something like, you young people want to know what I think is going on right now. And he's like, there are obviously, there are bad things afoot, and this is 1894. They've seen the failure of this latest attempt to have federal regulation to enforce Black men's right to vote in the South failed in 1890, 1891. They're seeing these new constitutions, new state constitutions, number of adverse Supreme Court decisions. And so he says, you young people want to know, what do I think? What's going to happen? And he takes stock in a way that's just really balanced and interestingly hopeful, where he says, based on what I've seen in my life, there's no time I'd rather be alive than the present. And he says, he talks about how nearby, just 30 years ago, armies had met on a battlefield in which white Virginians were fighting to preserve the enslavement of his race. And now a school run by a Black woman is opening on that very soil to educate Black children. And so he kind of encourages the young people in the audience to be hopeful and to keep pushing for what they want. Because even though there are clouds on the horizon, he's kind of saying, like, we have seen a lot of progress. We have seen huge changes in my lifetime, and keep going. So it's a very powerful speech.
Yeah, wow. Now, so we have a majority of teachers on the call, and I know there are some teachers you worked hand in hand with in sort of creating the text for this book. Tell us a little bit about that collaboration.
Sure, yeah. So there were so many collaborative aspects of this book. First, that it came out of a National Park Service initiative, the collaboration between Liz Clarke and me, which was amazing, and I learned so much from working with her. And then I also wanted to be able to, we tried to make the book both very adaptable to classrooms of a variety of different levels, while also having it be appealing to general readers who were not using it in a classroom. But on the teaching side, I worked with two teachers who may be here today in the Zoom audience, Crystal Davis and John Elfner at Homewood Flossmoor High School, which is a very large public high school in the Chicago area. And Crystal and John created curricular materials to go with the book. And in the book, there's a QR code that takes people to a website that's hosted by UNC Press. And I think that Ryan, put it in the chat. So you can go to it. That website is what you will get to if you use the QR code in the book. But there you'll find the materials that Crystal Davis and John Elfner created in collaboration with me that are designed to help teachers kind of bring some of this material into the classroom. And these materials are really wonderful. They do a lot of different things. Crystal and John are both like veteran expert teachers with experience teaching all different levels of history, of social studies, government. Crystal's been piloting the AP African American Studies class. John Elfner has taught AP US history a lot, as well as both of them teaching other levels. And the idea was, we know that teachers, first of all, are very pressed for time a lot, and also want to be able to adapt materials to their own uses, right? So they don't want to have something that feels so rigid that there's only one way to use it. So Crystal and John really conceived of these as being usable for a variety of different levels. Some of them can be used if you want to teach the whole book. Some can easily be used if you're only going to teach a chapter or two. So I think the materials that they created are really wonderful and very malleable, and I'm super grateful to them. And I hope that some of the people who are here today will want to check them out.
Absolutely. Well, our chat is starting to blow up. So just for my final question, I just wanted to know what you hope readers take away upon finishing this book.
Wow, well, that's a really big question. I guess I really hope I hope that readers will take away a better understanding of this really conflictual and really important period in American history. And I think that the graphic illustrations by Liz Clarke draw people in a way that makes it feel more, hopefully, like really real. And also, people have told me that there's something about the illustrations that help people create a more like emotional or affective connection with it, because you see these kind of real people living their lives. And so I really want this to help people see not just have a better and more accurate understanding of Reconstruction, but also to help people kind of get in touch with the past and past people who were not like us, but in some ways were like us. And I think that that is the kind of sense of empathy that we often try to teach when we teach history, both for people who we agree with, but also a kind of empathy for people who, were making the best decisions they could with what they had available. So, and finally, I mean, I think this period has a lot to tell us or give us about in terms of the present, because it's a reminder that the history of this country has been a very conflictual history, right? That like seeing conflicts now, seeing people arguing over what direction the nation should be going, how inclusive of a country is this? These are not new questions. These are questions that have been at the center of the history of this country from the beginning, and certainly were at the center of the Reconstruction story. So I hope it can also help people feel a little bit more oriented as we live through really tumultuous times.
Fantastic answer. Well, with that, I'm going to pass over to Ryan, who's going to start with our student scholar question of the week.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for that great back and forth. As Gina alluded to, we always begin this part of the program with our History Student Scholar question of the week. This is a competition in which students have the opportunity to submit a question. The winning question will be read aloud to our esteemed guests, and the winner will also receive a $50 gift card to our gift shop for themselves, and their teacher will also receive one as well. This week, we're really excited to have a question all the way from a school in Japan, Haro International School in Japan. Popo is the questioner in Mr. Bartlett's class. And the question is this: to what extent do you believe Black Americans exercised agency and actively shaped their own destinies rather than serving as passive recipients of top-down process but instituted by the ruling elite?
That's a very good question and a really sophisticated one. I think that, one of the things this book shows is how Black Americans made decisions to shape their own lives after slavery. And it really emphasizes that. And sometimes that story is lost when we focus on things like what Congress was doing or what the president was doing. That's a kind of more top-down political history. It is important because it's important for understanding how power kind of works. But what everyday people do to shape their lives also really matters, because part of what history is about understanding the lives of people in the past. And so, African Americans after slavery, I mentioned the Plummer family trying to reunite the family after Sarah Miranda had been sold to New Orleans. That story of Black families trying to come back together or to create new family forms and kind of connect with people in a variety of different family formations is a key story of Reconstruction. African Americans building institutions is also really important to Reconstruction and is a theme of the book. So, for example, I mean, the three main examples that the book talks about, in addition to building familial and kinship relationships, are building independent Black churches that are going to survive into the 20th century and indeed into the 21st century, building schools and getting education for Black children. So that includes, like Jenny Dean's school that I was describing, or the ways that African Americans contributed to creating schools for young children, to the creation of what we now call HBCUs, which a lot of them were founded in this period, though a lot of the ones that we still know today as historically Black colleges and universities. And finally, the third, so churches, schools, and then civil society organizations that African Americans created, mutual benefit societies, burial societies, clubs, the kinds of institutions that really sustain communities across generations. So all of those are examples of the ways that people were shaping their own lives and kind of trying to build the kind of world that they wanted to build, regardless of, or sort of regardless of what was coming out of Congress, right? There was a momentum that people had and expressing desires that we can see when we study this history.
Wow, that's awesome. Thanks so much for that great answer, and also the great question. We love getting international questions. It's not new to us, but we don't see it often, so we want them to keep coming. So our chat is blowing up, as Gina mentioned. Try to get to as many questions as possible. Richard says, or rather states, "Thank you so much, Professor. I've been a fan since they knew Lincoln." Question: How do you think Reconstruction in D.C. would have proceeded if Lincoln had not been killed? Does the experience of Reconstruction as attempted in Louisiana beginning in 1862 sort of foreshadow what possibly could have been? Others have asked this question in the chat too, echoing Pete, Richard, Pete and others, just about how I know historians are kind of leery about what if questions, but how could have this period been different if not for the events of April 1865?
Yeah, this is definitely a lot of people want to know about this question and think about it. Let's see. So Lincoln had shown himself as president to be a flexible and intelligent thinker and very good at politics, right? And so he was good at figuring out which way the winds were blowing with the Republican Party. As Eric Foner showed in his book, The Fiery Trial, which is about Lincoln, Lincoln often actually was a lagging behind the more progressive factions of the Republican Party and ended up doing what they wanted. So he would end up where Charles Sumner was a little, and people like that a little bit later. And so that we see that, for instance, with his Louisiana policy and moving toward Lincoln, moving toward the idea that Black men, or at least some Black men, should have the right to vote, which of course was a position that Black Americans had been taking for a very long time, and that white progressives on the left, or whatever you want to call it, of the Republican Party also already believed and were already advocating for. So that is on the one hand, that Lincoln was a much savvier politician than Andrew Johnson, who was about the least savvy politician you could probably imagine, and burned a lot of bridges, right? Never really was a Republican and couldn't even figure out how to work with Republicans in Congress to get more of what Johnson would have wanted, right? And instead of working with the moderate Republicans in Congress to get a more down the middle kind of Reconstruction policy, Johnson alienated those people, which resulted in a more progressive Reconstruction policy. So, when people ask the question, what would have happened if Lincoln had lived? I think that for one thing to keep in mind is, regardless of what a great politician Lincoln was, no single president could have in 2 terms or 3 terms, grappled with the magnitude of the problems created by the abolition of slavery, including and especially white Southern resistance, because white Southerners, for the most part, with some exceptions, had not wanted to give up slavery. They were not going to play by the rules. They were going to continue to violently and non-violently violate new federal policies. And it was a problem of a magnitude that is very, very hard for us to comprehend what exactly the federal government could have done under even the best leadership to make that to sort of bring about the nation that they were trying to, that those Republicans and African Americans were, white Republicans and African Americans were trying to bring about. And I think that sometimes the question of what would have happened if Lincoln had lived is framed out of a desire to believe that someone could have prevented the kinds of conflicts that you end up seeing in Reconstruction. Someone could have prevented the Ku Klux Klan. Somebody could have prevented lynching. Somebody could have made American race relations all better within 5-10 years of the Civil War. And my view is that could not possibly have happened, and that there are actually some very interestingly positive things about the fact that Johnson so alienated the Republicans in Congress that there was able to be a more kind of dramatic, military-driven Reconstruction policy in the South, instead of a more civil-driven one of the kind that actually Lincoln had proposed before he was assassinated. I'll stop talking. Obviously, I could talk about this for a long time.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. It's a huge, huge question. Elliot says that I teach eighth grade U.S. history, and one of the things I try to get across to my students is that while there were lots of Americans willing to free the slaves, they weren't willing to recognize equality for the newly freed slaves. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is that kind of an accurate way to frame this for his eighth graders?
Well, I think I'm not sure because I'm sure that's not the whole story, the whole picture for the eighth graders, but I think it's really important to emphasize that that white Republicans actually did push for a lot of racial equality measures and meaningfully. So there is a sort of narrative that uh, obviously white Southerners, many of them fought to preserve slavery, were interested in subjecting African Americans after slavery to the most coercive regime possible, short of slavery. But the question is really sort of about what was the position of like white Northerners. Of course, I put that in quotes because there are so many of them and they're divided into two major political parties, and the entire Democratic Party was probably against most forms of Reconstruction and wanted to just allow white Southerners to go ahead and have their way and not have much, if any, federal role in the South after the Civil War. But the Republican Party actually was quite different from that. And this is partly the point of my earlier book, Until Justice Be Done, which came out in 2021. The origins of the Republican Party, a lot of people talk about it as like they came together around opposing the expansion of slavery into the West. That is true. But they also had a strong current of racial egalitarianism running through the Republican Party, including white Republicans who became very powerful during and after the Civil War. And if there hadn't been white Americans who were willing to fight for racial equality, there would not have been a Civil Rights Act of 1866. There would not have been a 14th Amendment. There would not have been a 15th Amendment. And so I think it's actually really important to emphasize to students that there were a lot of white Americans who were standing up for forms of racial equality in this period, and that their goals and aspirations for this nation and the goals and aspirations for African Americans in this period were defeated by white supremacists, right? So it's not that there weren't white Americans who were standing up for this. There were, but they lost that battle.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you so much for that. Sam says, or rather states, my favorite resource for teaching this period so far is the American Social History Project's Freedom's Unfinished Revolution, Inquiry into the Civil War and Reconstruction. How might this work respond to and slash expand on this teaching guide? And are there any other resources besides your great work, which you think are really must-haves for teachers teaching this particular period, primary sources or others?
That's a good question. I'm not super familiar. I certainly know about the American Social History Project, but I'm not super familiar with their Reconstruction curriculum. I do think that one of the things that came out of that was this Eric Foner, Joshua Brown collaborative book called Final Freedom or Free at Last. I'm forgetting the title. It's a really good short history of Reconstruction that I have actually used in my classes. It's co-authored by Eric Foner and Joshua Brown, and Josh Brown was very, involved in the American Social History Project and is really interested in visual culture from that time period. And so that book actually has a lot of political cartoons and other things that can be really useful in teaching. The Zinn Education Project has done a lot of work on Reconstruction that I think is really good. They did a study of state standards for teaching Reconstruction, which is really illuminating. And they do have some, I think, very high quality teaching materials on their website. And but other than that, I think there's actually a lot of good stuff out there. And one thing that I've talked about with teachers frequently is just how much digital information is available to teachers now. And one of the struggles is to figure out like what's good, what's usable, and things like that. So yeah, and that's one of the reasons I really wanted to have curricular materials associated with this book, just to try to make it easier for teachers to get just something that's designed to go with this book, and then sort of make of it what you will.
Wow, well, I'm sure there's 200 plus people on this call right now, and many of them are teachers. I'm sure they greatly appreciate all these wonderful resources. Miriam says, would you talk a little bit about the Freedmen's Bureau and its role during Reconstruction? She's wondering when exactly did it end, if the 1877 date is a little bit murky. If you could just talk about that particular agency.
Sure, a question about the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau was a federal agency created by Congress in 1865, before actually the formal end of the war. And the aim of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was kind of it became housed within the War Department or the military, was to like oversee the transition from slavery to freedom. And so Freedmen's Bureau, the Bureau tried to put Freedmen's Bureau agents throughout the South. It was a sort of hierarchical structure where there would be what's called an assistant commissioner. The commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau was Oliver Otis Howard, who is the namesake of Howard University. So he's based in Washington. And then you have assistant commissioners in most of the different states had a kind of lead guy in the state, and then more local Freedmen's Bureau agents dispersed in the state. Although coverage was really uneven. It was kind of an unfunded mandate, so they didn't get funding until the second year of the Freedmen's Bureau. So anyway, to the extent that there were Freedmen's Bureau agents that were local, they were supposed to help with the transition from slavery to freedom, meaning that if you think about it, the idea of free labor, like the slavery had prevailed in Southern labor relations, such that white people were used to enslaving their workforce. That meant they did not pay them, they owned them, they could buy and sell their enslaved workers. And now what people are trying to do is implement a totally different system of labor that's guided by labor contracts, in which two parties enter into an agreement about what are the terms of work, what work am I going to do, how much am I going to get paid, when am I going to get paid. So one of the things that Freedmen's Bureau agents did was try to make sure that contracts were entered into and the contracts were enforced. The Freedmen's Bureau also provided some forms of poor relief, like for people who were displaced and impoverished. They provided some rations and food. And they also oversaw and they helped to they were involved in education, so they would donate buildings and sometimes land to schools, or they would provide building materials for Black communities to build their own schools. And then they sort of facilitated Northern teachers coming into the South and placed them in teaching. But it was very short-lived, so it really only existed in its most robust form from like 1865 to 1868 or so, 1867, 1868. And was fully shut down. The education stuff continued a little bit longer, but it was fully shut down by the beginning of the 1870s. So it was a very, very innovative federal agency that was designed to be short-lived and was short-lived. But the end of the Freedmen's Bureau, again, doesn't correlate to 1877. It ended much earlier than that. And the Freedmen's Bureau is represented in the graphic history too. There's some sort of the graphic history talks about how, like, one of the examples of how it became involved in education would be Black communities would pool their resources to hire a teacher, and even like people would donate. Let's say there was a free Black person, a person who had been free before the war could donate a parcel of land where a new school or a church or both could be built. And then they could apply to the Freedmen's Bureau to ask for a teacher to be sent to them. So we show some of that in the book.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And just keeping an eye on time, as always happens, these sessions are flying by. So I'll try to get to as many more questions as I can in the time that we have. Clarence says, as a teacher in the South, I teach about Southern life after Reconstruction. We call that period the New South. It runs concurrently with the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Has your research on the Reconstruction era taken you into this New South kind of period? Are you familiar with this lexicon? Anything else for Clarence?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I know that the New South is, quote unquote, New South is like part of the curriculum in a lot of places, I think, not just in the South. And the New South idea, as I would kind of gloss it, is, that this is a period when a lot of white Southerners are trying to think about economic development in the South. How do we make a more prosperous region? How do we kind of get ourselves out of being mired in the past and developing new forms of economy and thinking about more integration with the rest of the country and things like that. So I would say that that New South theme, I do not do a lot with that in the book, and it actually is sort of in the back of my mind. Because it's real, right? It's there, it's part of Southern history, and but it's just like we had limited space. I do talk about, one feature of the New South is this discussion of industrial education. What does that mean for African Americans? And if you really know the history, it's also like there's industrial education for white people too. But the idea that part of the New South model is to try to do more with public education, create a more educated populace. And so I talk a little bit about industrial education because Jenny Dean identified herself with the industrial education movement. But generally, no, that theme is not foregrounded in this book.
Okay, awesome explanation nevertheless. We have a couple of questions that are, I'll try to combine for the interest of time. Just wondering if there's any individuals or topics that there was not space for in the book, but you think would have, if there was a time and more space and more words to devote, could have been really interesting to include in this work?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, oh, the New South. Um, but also, yeah, I was saying to at one point I said to someone that like this whole book was an exercise in cutting things out, and one of the interesting things about working on the book was we had a predetermined number of graphic history pages. So at the outset, we decided that there were going to be 6 chapters and every chapter was going to be 12 pages. And then on every page, you could have anywhere from 1 to 6 frames. So like there was something very mathematical about working on the book and like you're trying to tell something coherent, something meaningful in a very circumscribed number of pages. And so it really was all about like shaping it, cutting things out, having it still make sense. Um, what's an example of that? I mean, there's a man named Calvin Chase, who was, I mentioned black newspapers earlier. He was a black newspaper editor in Washington, the editor of the Washington Bee newspaper. And he was super interesting because he was the editor for a very long time. The paper lasted a lot longer than most black newspapers of that time period. He was an activist against police brutality in Washington. He had a really interesting wife. And his project of publishing that paper for Washington's Black community and kind of he had aspirations for it to be much broader than that. And then combined with him, like the story of the Black press, especially in the 1880s and 90s, is so interesting. And I would have loved to have done more with that. And Ida B. Wells comes out of that. And Ida B. Wells is also in the book because she ends up in Washington. And so she's in the final chapter of the book. But she's very much a progenitor of the Black press, but she is building on earlier work of people like Calvin Chase.
Wow, fascinating. And again, I'll try to get one or two more questions if we have time. Sam, interesting question as we wrap things up. Sam says DC today, like many cities, continues to be quite segregated, with the southern quadrants and northeast quadrants primarily people of color, northwest section primarily white, although these patterns are starting to change a little bit. Do you think that this book and or your research can kind of help show a through line or kind of dovetail even slightly with how some of these segregation patterns developed in the 20th century?
Um, I not specifically on segregation patterns because as the question kind of suggests, like those type of segregation patterns that became very evident, especially in the post-World War II period, did not exist in the 19th century. It was a much smaller city, and like in terms of racial segregation of housing, it was a much more integrated city. I mean, there were huge inequalities of wealth, but in some ways, partly because of slavery itself and the tradition or whatever of having Black people working in the homes of white people. So there was actually a lot of not segregated kind of housing because the Black workforce was living near the white employers, in part because of that. I mean, a lot of southern cities that were built before the Civil War were like that. And, redlining and other kinds of policies that end up creating the post-World War II version of segregated DC are 20th century phenomena. I do think that the book, Washington, D.C. has always been a place that has, a history of local families who have lived there for generations, who feel very strongly identified as being from D.C., but then like a hugely transient population that comes in and out with different, administrations and things like that. And so I think the book, I like to think of imagine a lot of different readers in the DC region, but for those who are newcomers and don't know that much about the history of the place where they are, I do think that this, brings to light some really important aspects of the history of that region.
Wow, fascinating. And then lastly, and very briefly before I throw things back to Gina, we have a couple questions about Du Bois and him calling Reconstruction a splendid failure. Do you have any favorite primary sources for teachers about this period that they can use?
Well, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna keep talking about the book because it was so fun. So UNC Press published the book, and this is the second graphic history they've done, and I was like, I want to have primary sources in the book, and they're sort of like, really, are you sure? And I was like, yeah, and they're like, okay. So I'm not, but so I selected 8 sources in the book, and they are so
Perfect.
phenomenal. Well, I actually squeezed 2 into one. Editorials written by Calvin Chase about police violence in DC is one. An article about Black tourism in Harper's Ferry is one that's great. One from Nellie Arnold Plummer, part of the Plummer family, about how her mother escaped from slavery with children in tow is one. A letter from Emma Brown talking about teaching. So Frederick Douglass's speech when Jenny Dean School opened. So these sources, I think I selected them in part to represent different facets of the book. So I think they make a really great sort of package because they bring in a lot of different aspects of Reconstruction history.
Perfect. Yeah, one-stop shop, and
Yeah.
so many questions we didn't have time for. All of your answers can be found by getting your hands on this great book. There's links in the chat to do so, so we encourage everyone to do that. Gina, back to you for some final thoughts.
Yes, and as Ryan mentioned, if you get the book today at bookshop.org, the affiliate commission we receive supports our programming for history teachers and students. And we hope you'll join us next week as we welcome the author of The Last 100 Days, FDR at War and Peace. And as always, you can go to our archive of more than 250 scholar presentations at gilderlerman.org/bookbreaks, along as historical documents, essays, the Hamilton Education Program, online exhibitions, and so much more. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today. This was such a fantastic discussion.
Thank you so much. It was absolutely my pleasure.
Have a great day, everyone.